The auctioneer cleared his throat and called the lot a second time. The crate sat in the middle of the yard like a stone in a streambed, something the current of bidding had flowed around and left behind. 27 turkey poults, small and pale, cheeping in a thin, uncertain chorus. The auctioneer had announced them plainly, without adornment. Blind from birth, every last one. And the crowd had stepped back as a single body, as if blindness were something that might be caught by proximity. Welcome to Frontier Secrets. I am your narrator, Elias Vance. Here, we unearth the forgotten stories of the American frontier, the tales of women and men who built something from nothing, who turned mockery into legacy, who held fast when the world laughed and the wind howled and the ground itself seemed determined to break them. This is one of those stories. And it begins, as so many do, with a woman alone at an auction, with nothing in her purse but the price of a mistake everyone else was smart enough to avoid. Her name was Margaret Devereaux. She was 28 years old, thin-framed, with the kind of quiet that comes not from timidity but from economy, a woman who had learned early that words cost something, and that the currency of the frontier was not coin alone. Her coat was clean but worn at the elbows, the fabric soft and thinning in the way of fabric that has been brushed against fence posts and wagon seats 1,000 times. The leather satchel over her shoulder had been repaired twice at the strap, knotted in 2 places where the leather had given way, and been coaxed back together with the patient hands of someone who could not afford to replace it. She carried it the way people carry the things they cannot afford to lose. She stopped in front of the crate. She crouched down and looked. The poults were bumping softly into the slats, into each other, into nothing at all. Their eyes were clouded and white, like creek ice in early winter. Useless, most men there would have told her, and several were already composing the words. The rancher got there first. He stood at the rail of the paddock fence, large and weathered, accustomed to being the loudest opinion in any yard he entered. He had 200 head of cattle on the finest spread in the county, and his own flock of 31 free-ranging turkeys that he considered beneath his attention, but well within his authority to discuss. He said something short and carrying, something about blind birds and foolish women, and the men around him laughed. She did not look up. She counted out $3.40 from the small cloth purse at the bottom of her satchel. She counted it twice because it was the kind of counting a person does when they already know the number and are simply making peace with it. Every cent she had to her name. The filing fee for her homestead claim was still owed. The general store account was sitting quiet only because the storekeeper was a patient man, and patience, she had learned, had its own quiet expiration date. She handed the coins to the auctioneer with the steady hand of someone making a decision, not a mistake. He looked at her, then at the crate. Then he took the money. Behind her, the laughter ran its course and settled back into the ordinary noise of the yard. The rancher had already turned away, satisfied that the morning's entertainment had reached its natural conclusion. The blind poults tapped against the slats. She lifted the crate herself. 27 birds, $3.40. 1 homestead claim unpaid. The arithmetic of it would have frightened a cautious woman. Margaret carried them home. If these forgotten stories of the frontier speak to your heart, subscribe to Frontier Secrets and stay by the fire a little longer. The crate rode in the back of her wagon for the 3 miles home, and the poults made noise the entire way. A thin, urgent sound, not quite a call and not quite a complaint, but something between the two that suggested they were aware something had changed, and were not yet convinced the change was in their favor. She set the crate in the yard, unlatched the front slat, and stepped back to give them room. 27 birds hit open air and immediately proved every doubter right. They scattered in directions that seemed to bear no relationship to one another or to any visible logic of the yard. 2 walked directly into the fence and stood there, pressing forward, as though the fence might eventually agree with them. A cluster of 5 circled the same patch of bare dirt in tight, urgent rotations, each one bumping the back of the one ahead. Several simply sat where they had come to rest, and breathed as though the act of moving had exhausted them entirely. One walked straight into the water trough. She pulled it out. It walked back toward the trough. She stood in the middle of this and let the full weight of $3.40 rest on her shoulders for a moment. Then she rolled up her sleeves and went to work. She built a small pen from spare fence boards against the south wall of the cabin, a tight space, nowhere to stray, and she moved them into it one by one, which took longer than it should have because twice she lost count and had to start again. By the time the last pullet was inside and the board was braced across the front, the sun was well past noon, and she had already earned a day's worth of tired. They settled somewhat. Not peacefully, but somewhat. Enough that she could leave them long enough to eat. She did not sleep that night. That was not a decision she made so much as one made for her, because the sounds from the pen were the sounds of small creatures in continuous low distress. Nothing sharp, nothing dying, just the steady testimony of 27 birds who had no way of knowing where the edges of the world were. She sat against the cabin wall in the dark with her knees drawn up and watched them through the gap in the boards. It was somewhere in the hours before dawn, when the last of the night was thin and uncertain, that she noticed it. She had shifted her position and said something, not to them, just the kind of word that comes out when tired bones find a cold board, and the pen went still. Not quiet the way animals go quiet when a predator passes. Still. Oriented. 27 small heads lifted and turned, all of them angled in the same direction toward her. She sat very straight and did not move. Then she said the word again, low and deliberate, and watched every one of them hold. The sky was just beginning to gray at its edges. She reached for her satchel, set it across her knees, and thought about that. By the time the sun had cleared the eastern ridge and the dew was burning off the grass, she had a method, not a theory, not a hope, a method, which is a different thing entirely, and she had always understood the difference. She started that same morning, before she touched the feed tin, before she unlatched the pen. She crouched just outside the boards and made the sound, a low two-note call. The first note dropping, the second held just a beat longer than felt natural. Not a whistle exactly. Something between a whistle and a word, low enough to carry without carrying far. She waited 3 seconds, then opened the latch and poured the feed. 27 heads swung toward the sound before the grain hit the trough. She noted that, filed it the way a woman files things when there is no paper and the only ledger available is her own mind. She did it again at the midday feeding, again at dusk. The same two-note call every time, before the latch moved, before the grain poured, before anything else happened in their small, blind world. It was the announcement of order. This sound means what you need is coming. This sound means orient here. The stick came on the third day. She had cut a length of hazel from the creek brush and stripped it clean, and she used it not to direct or discipline, but simply to tap. Steady, quiet percussion on the packed earth as she walked. 2 taps, then the call, then forward. She moved them in slow loops around the yard, the kind of loops that had no purpose a neighboring farmer would have recognized as useful. Twice a day, morning and late afternoon, 27 blind birds learning the dimensions of a world they could not see, mapped entirely in sound. It was unglamorous work. There was nothing in it that photographed well. Nothing that would have drawn admiration from a man watching over a fence rail. What it looked like to anyone passing the road was a woman walking in circles with a stick and making a low noise to herself, followed by a shuffling collection of poults that bumped into each other and occasionally sat down for no apparent reason. They passed, those neighbors, one, then another, then the same one again on a Thursday, and he did not bother to slow his horse. The laughter that reached her was the easy, unself-conscious kind. The kind that does not need an audience because it is so thoroughly convinced of itself. She tapped the stick twice, made the call, and turned the flock left along the fence line. They turned with her. Not all at once, not perfectly, not in any way that would have impressed anyone who happened to glance over the railing that Thursday morning. But they turned. And the next morning, they turned a half-second faster. And the morning after that, a half-second faster still. And she was the only one close enough to notice. Which was, she was beginning to think, precisely the kind of advantage that tends to compound quietly over time. By the end of the 4th week, something had shifted in the way the flock moved. Though shifted is perhaps too dramatic a word for what was, in truth, a slow accumulation of small corrections. They no longer sat down for no apparent reason. They no longer walked directly into the water trough and stood there, confused, until she redirected them with the tap of her stick. They moved behind her voice, the way a river moves behind a grade. Not because they were forced, but because the channel had been worn into something they recognized. 40 feet. That was the distance she measured one still morning by pacing it out herself, heel to toe, along the dry grass beside the fence. She stood at the far end, said nothing, let the flock settle into their usual loose, shuffling arrangement near the feed dish. Then she made the call, low, even, 2 notes that had no particular beauty, but had by now been repeated so many times that they had acquired a kind of authority, the way anything repeated with precision eventually does. Every one of the 27 birds raised their heads. They came toward her in the same way they did most things. Not in a line, not in any formation that would have satisfied a military mind, but together. That was the word that mattered, together. Moving as a loose, unhurried unit across the yard, adjusting around each other without collision, orienting to the sound as if the sound were the only fixed point in the world, which for them it was. She stood very still and let them arrive at her feet. Then she heard the horse. She did not turn immediately. She tapped the stick twice, gave the secondary signal, and waited for the flock to settle before she looked toward the road. By then, he had already slowed. The rancher from the auction yard. The man with the large spread and the 31 free-ranging birds and the loud, uncomplicated laugh. He was moving at a pace that had no practical reason behind it. A man covering ground moves at one speed. A man who has seen something that does not match what he expected moves at another. He did not stop. He did not call out. He looked at the flock, at the way they stood clustered behind her, calm, oriented, not bumping into the fence post directly in front of 3 of them. And then he looked at her. And then he looked at the flock again. His horse took 2 more slow steps and stopped entirely of its own accord. Because horses, unlike their riders, have no pride invested in pretending not to notice things. She kept her eyes on her birds. He stayed at that unhurried pace for longer than a man passes something uninteresting. The road was not complicated. There was no reason to linger unless the lingering was the point. She did not give him the satisfaction of acknowledgement, which was its own kind of answer to a question he had not yet figured out he was asking. Then the horse moved on, and the dust settled, and the flock stood quietly at her feet. Midsummer arrived the way trouble usually does in eastern Montana, quietly at night while everyone was looking elsewhere. The first report came from the homestead 2 miles east. 11 birds gone between dusk and first light. No feathers in the yard, which meant they had not been taken there. They had simply wandered the way free-ranging flocks do when something startles them in the dark, scattered into the tall grass at the field's edge, and the coyotes had done the rest at their leisure. The neighbor walked his fence line twice the following morning, counting gaps that weren't there. The gap was not in the fence. The gap was in the birds themselves. No voice to answer, no call to return to. Nothing to orient toward but open ground in the particular silence that precedes a coyote's patience. She heard about it at the general store from a woman who relayed it the way people relay disaster, with sorrow in the mouth and something else entirely in the eyes. She listened. She said nothing useful to say about it. She walked home with her flour and her quiet. And that evening she counted her own birds twice, standing in the yard with the feed satchel over her shoulder, calling the low note once, watching all 27 faces turn toward her in the half-dark. The second report was harder to hear, though she would not have said so aloud. The large rancher to the north lost 8 birds in a single night. The story moved through the county faster than the others because he was a man whose losses drew attention the way a tall tree draws lightning. Not because anyone wished it, but because the height made it visible. A coyote, people said, maybe 2. The birds had ranged south toward the creek at twilight, as they apparently did each evening without incident. Until the evening, they did not return. He had 31 birds at the start of summer. He had 23 now, and the season was barely half over. She thought about his flock. She had seen them once through a fence line in late spring. Large, healthy birds, good color. roaming freely across the grass, the way expensive things sometimes do when their owner trusts that the world will accommodate them. Free-ranging, all of them, uncalled, unoriented to anything but appetite. She did not feel satisfaction. That is worth saying plainly, because the temptation would be to assign her some small quiet pleasure in the symmetry of it. And she was not built that way. What she felt was closer to recognition. The particular recognition of a woman who has solved a problem others did not yet know was a problem, watching the problem arrive on schedule. Her 27 birds stood clustered in the yard as the sun went down, gathered around the worn leather satchel she had set against the post while she worked the latch. Not one of them had wandered past the sound of her. Not one had ranged toward the creek or the tall grass or anything beyond the reach of her voice. Untouched. Every last one. He came on a Tuesday, which she noted not because the day mattered, but because she'd been expecting him since Friday, and the waiting had grown tedious. She heard the horse before she heard the man, a slow, deliberate approach, the kind a person makes when they do not want to appear hurried. She was at the near post of the yard fence, re-knotting the satchel strap where it had begun to fray again at the second knot, and she did not look up immediately. She let him arrive on his own schedule. He pulled up at the fence line and sat for a moment without speaking. She finished the knot. "Your birds," he said finally, "don't stray." It was not a question, but it was not quite a statement either. It sat somewhere in the middle, in that particular territory men occupy when they want information and are constitutionally opposed to asking for it. "No," she said, "they don't." A pause. His horse shifted. He did not. "Mine did," he said. She looked up then. His jaw was set in the way of a man who has recently revised a long-held opinion about something and has not yet made peace with the revision. He was looking at her flock, all 27 of them, clustered in their loose, easy group near the water trough, orienting to the small sounds of the yard, unhurried and entirely present. "I've got 8 left," he said. It came out flat, the way factual statements sometimes do when the facts are embarrassing. She nodded once. Then she told him. She told him about the first week. The erratic circling, the bumping, the birds that could not find the feed pan from 3 feet away. She told him about the accident of stillness, how they had frozen when she spoke, how she had noticed, and what she had done with the noticing. She told him about the call, low, repeated, always before feeding, never used for anything else. She told him about the stick and the tapping, the slow loops around the yard, the weeks of it, the patience of repetition until the sound of her voice meant one thing and one thing only. Here, safe, food, stay. She explained it plainly and without embellishment, detail by concrete detail, the way you explain a practical thing to a person who has a practical need to understand it. Halfway through, he took off his hat. She noticed. She continued without remarking on it. When she finished, the yard was quiet except for the ordinary sounds of 27 birds going about the business of late afternoon. He turned his hat in his hands once, looking at the flock. The gesture was not quite humility, but it was close, the visible edge of it at least. "That's all of it?" he asked. "That's all of it," she said. He looked at her then, directly, for the first time since he had ridden up. It was a different kind of looking than she had seen from him before. She filed it away without deciding what to do with it. August came in hard and dry. The kind of heat that sits on a yard like a hand pressing down. The grass along the fence line went brittle. The water trough needed filling twice a day instead of once. She did it without complaint, because the work was the work, and complaining to no one solved nothing. She noticed his flock thinning before he said a word about it. She noticed because she was observant by nature and practical by necessity. And because the fence between their properties was only a fence, not a wall. First, the numbers dropped. 31 birds became 20, became 12, became a scattered handful she could count from her side without trying. The free-ranging birds wandered as free-ranging birds do, and the county was full of reasons not to wander. Coyotes moving with the dry season, hawks working the open ground. The kind of quiet that meant something had gone wrong before you had the chance to call it back. You cannot call back a bird that has never learned to listen. By the middle of August, there were none. He came to the fence line on a Tuesday late in the afternoon, when the air had begun to soften slightly and her flock was finishing its last loop of the yard. She had just called them, one low note repeated twice, the same as always, and 27 birds were settling toward their shelter in the unhurried, orderly way they had perfected over months of practice. She was brushing dust from the leather strap of her feed satchel, the one knotted twice where it had broken and been repaired, when she heard his horse on the road. She did not look up immediately. He dismounted and stood at the fence. She finished what she was doing, then looked over. He had his hat in his hand. He'd had it in his hand the last time, too, toward the end of their conversation, but that had been a slow arrival. This time it was already there before he spoke. "I've lost my flock," he said. No preamble, no softening. "I know," she said. The birds rustled behind her, settling. "I'd like to purchase surplus birds," he said, "if you have them." She looked at him for a moment, not unkindly, but without hurry. "I don't," she said. He absorbed this without visible reaction, which she noted as a small kind of progress in the man. A month ago, there would have been a tightening, a redirect. Now there was just the quiet. "Everyone I have will walk into that fair in September," she continued, and she said it not as a boast, not as a reproach, but as a plain and necessary statement of fact. He looked at the flock, at the 27 birds, calm and close, already quiet in their shelter. He looked back at her. "The railroad contract," he said, not a question. "Yes," she said. The evening light came down long and level across the yard, and neither of them looked away. The evening light had faded to the soft gray of late dusk before she finally moved from the fence line. The rancher had ridden off without another word, but the weight of what had passed between them lingered in the air like the smell of rain on dry ground. She stood a moment longer, watching the dark shapes of her flock settle into their shelter, then walked inside and lit the lamp. She did not sleep well that night, not because of worry, but because of something closer to anticipation. The kind that sits low in the chest and refuses to be talked into stillness. The railroad contract was not yet signed. The fair was 3 weeks away, and the water rights he had spoken of, the spring-fed creek that crossed onto her claim at the corner post, that was not a gift, not yet. It was a possibility. And possibilities, she had learned, were only as solid as the next morning's intentions. The next morning arrived with the same dry heat that had settled over the county like a blanket pulled too tight. She fed her birds, called them, walked them in their slow loop around the yard. 27 heads turned with her voice. 27 bodies followed. And if anyone had been watching from the road that morning, they would have seen the same strange sight they had seen all summer. A woman walking in circles with a stick, followed by a shuffling collection of blind birds that moved as though they could see the shape of her voice in the air. But no one was watching that morning. The road was empty. She went to town for flour and salt, and the general store was where she first felt the change. It was subtle at first, the way changes in small towns often are. The storekeeper, Mr. Davies, was a round man with a patient face and the kind of eyes that had seen too many homesteaders fail to be surprised by much. He took her order without comment, wrote it in his ledger, and then hesitated. "Saw you had company yesterday," he said, not looking up. She waited. "Heard Henry Tolland stopped by your place." "So the rancher had a name, Henry Tolland." She filed it away. "He did," she said. Davies looked up then, and there was something in his face she could not quite name. Curiosity, perhaps. Or the beginnings of respect. Hard to tell in the low light of the store. "Lots of folks losing birds this season," he said. "Tough year." "Yes," she said. He wrapped her order in brown paper and tied it with string. She paid with the last of her coins and walked out into the bright, hard light of the street. That was when she heard it. Laughter, from the bench outside the post office. 3 men she recognized by sight, but not by name. They were not laughing at anything she could see. But as she passed, one of them said something low, and the laughter rose again, and she felt it land on her back like a pebble thrown at a window. Small, but it made a sound. She did not turn. She kept walking, flour sack under one arm, the worn satchel over her shoulder. But she heard the word. It carried just enough to reach her. Blind. And another word, softer but unmistakable. Woman. The drought deepened through the second week of August. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of her claim shrank to a trickle, then to a series of muddy pools, then to nothing but dry, cracked earth that curled at the edges like old paper. She hauled water from the well twice a day, filling the trough for her birds, carrying buckets to the small garden she had planted in the spring, where the beans had curled into brown spirals and the squash blossoms had dropped without fruiting. The birds did not wander. They stayed close to the pen, close to the sound of her voice, close to the water she brought them. And while other flocks across the county scattered toward dry creek beds and never returned, hers held. She did not think of this as a victory. It was simply the outcome of the system she had built. But the system had cost her everything she had, and the debt at the general store was growing, and the filing fee for her homestead claim was still 3 months past due. On a Thursday, she walked the 2 miles to the county land office to ask for an extension. The clerk was a thin man with spectacles and a habit of not meeting her eyes. He listened to her request, shuffled papers, and told her that extensions were granted only in cases of documented hardship. She stood in the small, dusty office and felt the weight of the word. Hardship. As if the drought and the empty purse and the laughter in the street were not hardship enough. As if hardship required a signature. She signed the form, left the office, and walked home. The road was quiet. The dust rose in pale clouds around her boots. And in the distance, she could see the dark shape of Henry Tollin's barn, its roof sagging slightly at the ridge, the same way everything sagged under the weight of the dry season. She did not stop. She did not look. But she thought about the creek, about the spring-fed water he had mentioned, and about the deed that still sat in the county office, unamended, unimproved, with only her name on it. The third week of August brought the first real test of her method, and it came not from coyotes or drought, but from a traveling preacher who had set up his tent on the edge of town. He had come to save souls, as he put it, and he had brought with him a following of the curious and the bored. Word of the blind birds had reached him, and he arrived at her fence on a Sunday afternoon with a small crowd trailing behind him like geese behind a feed bucket. She was in the yard, mid-loop, the stick in her hand, the call low on her lips. She did not stop when she saw them. She finished the loop, tapped the stick twice, and settled the flock near the water trough before she turned. The preacher was a tall man with a voice that carried without effort. He asked her, loud enough for the crowd to hear, whether she had considered that her birds might be a sign. A test from the Lord. A lesson in the folly of trusting in earthly methods. She looked at him. She looked at the crowd. She looked at the birds, standing quiet and calm at her feet. "They're just birds," she said, "and they're not lost." The crowd laughed. Not with her, but at her. The preacher smiled the smile of a man who has already decided what the story means and does not need the facts to agree with him. He said something about pride, about the danger of trusting in one's own understanding, about the way the Lord could humble a person who thought she had found a path others had missed. She listened. She did not argue. She called her birds, tapped the stick, and walked them toward the shelter. The crowd dispersed, still laughing, still telling the story to each other as they walked back toward town. The preacher folded his tent that evening and moved on to the next county. But the story stayed. By the end of August, she had become a kind of local curiosity. The woman with the blind birds who thought she could train them to stay. The one who had spent her last $3.40 on a crate of useless poults and now walked them in circles like a mother hen with a brood of broken chicks. The laughter had not stopped. It had simply changed in quality. It was no longer the sharp, dismissive laughter of the auction yard. It was the slower, more comfortable laughter of a town that has found a reliable source of entertainment. She heard it at the post office, where the postmaster handed her a letter from the railroad company confirming the fair date and the contract terms. And the man behind her in line made a comment about how she might want to bring a map in case her birds got lost on the way there. She heard it at the well, where 2 women drawing water fell silent as she approached, then resumed their conversation in tones that were just low enough to be private and just loud enough to carry. She heard it from her own fence line, where a boy of about 12 had climbed the post to watch her morning loop, and when she looked up, he was grinning in the particular way of a child who has been told something is funny and is trying to decide whether to agree. She did not shoo him away. She finished her loop, called the birds, and walked back to the cabin. But that night, sitting on the cabin step with the feed satchel across her knees, she let herself feel the weight of it, the isolation, the thinness of her funds, the way the town had drawn a line around her and labeled her the kind of woman who did foolish things. She had known this would happen. She had counted on it, in a way, because the alternative was that no one noticed at all, and that would have meant her work was invisible. But knowing it and living through it were different things. She looked at the satchel in her hands. The strap, knotted twice, worn smooth at both knots. She had carried it since the day she arrived on this claim. It had held her filing papers, her coins, her hope. It had held the $3.40 that bought the birds. It held nothing now but a bit of string and the memory of what she had spent. She set it aside, went inside, and slept. The first day of September came with a wind that smelled of change. Not rain. The sky was still clear and hard as glass, but something else. The kind of shift that happens when a season is about to turn, and the land knows it before the people do. She rose before dawn. She fed her birds by lamplight, using the call, watching the pale heads turn toward her in the dark. She walked them in their last loop before the fair, and she did it slowly, deliberately, the way a person does something for the last time without knowing it will be the last. She had prepared for this day. She had counted her birds, checked their feathers, made sure each one was healthy and alert. She had washed her coat and mended the hem where it had begun to fray. She had packed her satchel with the letter from the railroad company, the entry form for the fair, and a piece of bread wrapped in cloth. She had not slept well, but she had slept enough. The walk to the fairground took 2 hours. She started early, before the sun was fully up, and she walked at the pace of the flock, slow, steady, unhurried. The road was empty. The dust rose around them. The birds moved behind her voice, and she counted them every few minutes, not because she thought any would stray, but because counting had become a habit, and habits are hard to break. She arrived at the fairground as the gates were opening. The agent from the railroad was already there, standing near the judging table with a clipboard and a face that gave nothing away. He watched her approach, watched the birds, watched the way they held formation behind her, calm and close, as if they had been doing this all their lives, which, in a way, they had. She registered at the table. The clerk looked at her entry form, looked at the birds, looked at her, and said nothing. But she saw the corners of his mouth twitch, and she knew what he was thinking. She walked her flock to the designated pen, called them inside, and closed the gate. The fairground filled slowly. Farmers and ranchers and their families arrived in wagons and on foot, leading livestock, carrying crates of produce, hauling quilts and preserves, and hand-carved furniture. The noise grew. The dust rose. The sun climbed higher and hotter. She stood at the fence of her pen and watched the other entries arrive. The Jensen flock, 30 birds, large and loud, pressing against their pen with the restless energy of creatures that had never learned to settle. The Morrison turkeys, 21 of them, strutting and aggressive, pecking at each other through the slats. The Callahan geese, which were not turkeys at all, but had been entered in the poultry category because Mr. Callahan believed in creative interpretation of the rules. And then she saw Henry Tolland. He was not entering birds. He had no birds to enter, but he was there, standing near the edge of the judging area, his hat in his hands, watching. He did not approach her. He did not speak, but he was watching, and she felt the weight of it, different from the weight of the crowd, heavier. The judging began at 10 o'clock. The head judge was a man named Porter, a retired farmer from the next county who had been judging poultry at harvest fairs for 20 years and had developed the particular expression of someone who has seen every variation of feather and fowl and is no longer surprised by any of it. He started with the Jensen flock. He made notes. He moved on to the Morrisons, more notes. He passed the geese without comment, which Mr. Callahan took as a personal insult. And then he reached her pen. He stood at the fence and looked at the birds. 27 turkeys, quiet, settled, oriented toward the sound of her breathing, not pacing, not pressing against the slats, not pecking at each other, simply present, the way a flock is present when it knows exactly where it is and has no reason to question it. Judge Porter looked at his clipboard. He looked at the birds again. He looked at her. "These yours?" he asked. "Yes, sir." He nodded slowly. He made a note. He moved on. The crowd that had gathered to watch the judging had already begun to disperse, bored by the lack of incident. There had been no escaped birds, no pecking fights, no dramatic scenes, just a woman and a pen of quiet turkeys, which was not the kind of story that would be told at supper tables. But Judge Porter did not disperse. He walked back to her pen at the end of the judging after all the other entries had been evaluated, and he stood there for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that was not loud but carried, "I don't know how you did it, but these are the finest turkeys I've seen in 5 years." She did not smile. She did not thank him. She simply stood at the fence and watched her birds, and let the words settle around her like dust after rain. The crowd began to turn back. The murmur rose, and from the edge of the clearing, Henry Tolland watched, his hat still in his hands, his face unreadable in the hard September light. The crowd stood frozen for a long breath, suspended between the judge's words and the machinery of understanding that would translate them into belief. Judge Porter did not repeat himself. He did not need to. He was not a man given to repetition, and the silence that followed his pronouncement was the kind that confirms rather than questions. She stood at the fence, her hands resting on the top rail, and let the silence do its work. The birds settled behind her, 27 pale bodies shifting in the afternoon light, their heads turning toward the small sounds of the crowd. Not afraid, not curious, simply present in the particular way that creatures are present when they feel no need to flee. The railroad agent stepped forward. He had been standing at the edge of the judging area, clipboard in hand, and he moved with the deliberate economy of a man who has made his decision and is simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. He held out his hand, and she took it. "The contract is yours, Miss Devereaux," he said. The words landed in the crowd like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples spread outward. First the men nearest the judging table, then those farther back, then the women standing near the refreshment tent, who had been watching with the particular attention of people who had heard the laughter and were waiting to see whether it had been misdirected. She signed her name on the line. The leather of her satchel strap brushed against her wrist as she leaned forward, and she felt the familiar texture of the knots against her skin. 2 of them, worn smooth. The contract called for 80 birds by spring. She had 27. But she knew what 77 more could be built from, and she knew what she had learned, and she knew that the path from 27 to 80 was a path she had already started walking. She folded the contract and placed it inside her coat, against her ribs. The crowd had begun to murmur. Some of it was admiration, or at least the cautious cousin of admiration that small towns extend to any success that cannot be ignored. Some of it was the old laughter, quieter now, but not gone. A man near the back said something about luck, and another man agreed, and the word floated through the air like a seed that had not yet found soil. She did not answer them. She called her birds, tapped the stick against the gate, and began the slow walk back toward the pen where they would stay until the fair ended at sundown. Henry Tolland was waiting near the supply tent. He had not approached during the judging, had not joined the crowd that pressed around the table to see the signed contract. He stood apart, hat in his hands, watching her approach. She stopped a few feet from him. The flock settled behind her, arranging themselves in the loose cluster they always formed when she stopped. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I've been thinking about the water rights." She waited. "The spring-fed creek," he said. "It crosses your corner post. I've got a map at the house. I'd like to show it to you." She looked at him. The drought pressed down around them, dry and heavy, and she thought about the long walk back to her claim, the empty water trough, the parched ground. She thought about the contract in her coat and the 77 birds she did not yet have. "I'll come tomorrow," she said. He nodded. Then he did something she did not expect. He looked past her at the flock and said, "They held. Even with the crowd, even with the noise, they held." "Yes," she said. He looked at her then, directly, the way he had looked at her only twice before. This time, there was something different in it, something quieter. "I've been running this land for 22 years, he said, "And I never learned what you learned in one summer." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. She called her birds, tapped the stick, and walked toward the pen. The fair ended at dusk. She walked home through the fading light, the flock moving behind her like a single, quiet body. The contract sat against her ribs. The satchel hung from her shoulder. The knots in the strap had held. The drought did not break. September passed in a long, dry haze. The creek that had been a trickle became a memory, and the well on her claim began to pull up mud instead of water. She hauled buckets from the shallow pond a quarter-mile to the north, where the water was still clear but shrinking by the day. The birds did not complain. They followed her voice, drank what she gave them, and stayed close to the pen. She had begun planning for the spring flock. She had counted her savings, what remained after the filing fee was finally paid, and knew she could afford a dozen more poults, maybe 15 if she stretched. The railroad contract called for 80 birds, but the payment came upon delivery, not before. The math was tight. It was the kind of tight that kept a woman awake at night, staring at the ceiling, calculating feed costs and survival rates in the dark. She had gone to Henry Tolland's house on the morning after the fair, as promised. He had spread the map across his kitchen table, and together they had traced the line of the spring-fed creek that wound through his property and touched the corner of hers. He had offered her the water rights outright, not a loan, not a trade, not a condition. A simple, legal transfer of access to the water that ran through the corner of her claim. She had asked him why. He had taken a long time to answer. Then he had said, "Because I've been watching, and I think you might know something the rest of us have forgotten." She had signed the papers that afternoon, with a clerk from the county office as witness. The deed amendment was filed the following week. The water had not come. The spring-fed creek had run dry by the end of summer, the same as every other creek in the county. The drought was not moved by legal documents, but the document meant something. It meant that when the rains came, if they came, the water on her corner post would be hers, free and clear, unencumbered by any agreement that could be revoked. She held that knowledge close, the way she held the contract, the way she held the fading hope that the sky would change. October arrived without mercy. The grass along the fence line had turned to powder. The garden was a memory. The birds had begun to lose weight, despite her careful feeding, because the feed she could afford was not as rich as the feed she would have bought if she had had the money. She cut rations. She stretched the grain with cracked corn and kitchen scraps. The birds followed her voice, but she could feel the thinness in them, the way a mother feels the thinning of a child who cannot tell her he is hungry. November brought a cold snap that froze the shallow pond solid. She broke the ice each morning with the heel of her boot and dipped the bucket into the dark water beneath. The birds clustered together for warmth, and she moved them into the shelter at night, closing the door against the wind. The laughter had stopped. It had stopped sometime in late September, after the fair, when the news of the railroad contract had settled into the town's understanding of who she was. She was no longer the woman who had bought blind birds. She was the woman who had trained them, who had signed a contract, whose flock had held while others scattered. But the laughter had been replaced by something else, a kind of waiting. The kind of waiting that a town does when it expects a person to fail, and is simply being patient for the evidence. She felt it every time she went to the general store. The storekeeper, Mr. Davies, was polite, but his politeness had a watchful quality. He did not extend credit, but he did not refuse it either. He waited. The drought continued. The coyotes grew bolder. There were reports of losses from every farm within 10 miles. Mrs. Callahan lost her entire flock of 7 geese to a single night's raid. The Morrison turkeys, once strutting and aggressive, were reduced to 6 birds huddled in a pen with a broken latch. She counted her own flock each evening. 27. Still 27. But the feed was running low, and the winter was long, and the spring was still a promise written on paper that the ground had not yet agreed to honor. She woke one morning in early December to find the sky a different color. It was not the pale, washed-out blue of the drought months. It was a thick, gray-white, the color of something heavy and full. She stood in the yard, the feed satchel over her shoulder, and watched the clouds gather. The birds stirred behind her, restless, sensing the shift in the air. At noon, the first flake fell. She caught it on her palm and watched it melt. It was cold and clean and wet, and she had not realized how dry the world had become until she felt the water on her skin. By evening, the ground was white. The drought had broken. She stood at the door of the shelter, watching the snow fall in the lamplight, and she felt something loosen in her chest. The spring-fed creek would run again. The garden would grow. The feed would stretch further now that the birds could forage in the thaw. But winter had only just begun, and the snow that had come to save her would also bury her if she was not careful. She closed the shelter door and went inside. That was when she heard the sound from the barn that was not a barn, but a lean-to she had built against the cabin wall. A high, thin cry, different from the birds. She pulled on her coat and stepped out into the snow, lantern raised. A coyote stood at the edge of the lean-to, its body low and still, its eyes reflecting the lamplight like twin embers. It had found the gap she had missed, a space between the boards where the frost had pulled the nails loose. The birds were pressed against the far wall, silent and rigid. The coyote's head turned toward her, and it did not move. She did not have a weapon. She had never owned a gun. She stood in the snow with the lantern in one hand and the empty feed bucket in the other, and she looked at the coyote, and the coyote looked at her. Then from the darkness behind her, a voice. "Step back, Miss Devereaux." It was Henry Tolland. He was standing at the corner of the cabin, a rifle in his hands, his breath clouding in the cold air. She had not heard him approach. She stepped back. The rifle cracked once, sharp and final in the still winter air. The coyote crumpled into the snow. The birds did not scatter. They stood where they were, pressed against the far wall, waiting for the call they knew was coming. She made it. Low and steady, the same two notes. And 27 heads turned toward her, and the tension in the lean-to dissolved like the first flake on her palm. Henry Tolland lowered the rifle. He stood in the snow, not looking at the coyote, not looking at the birds, looking at her. "I was passing," he said. She did not ask what he was passing at midnight in a snowstorm. She did not need to. She said, "Thank you." He nodded. He turned and walked back into the darkness, and the snow swallowed his footsteps before they could settle. The snow did not stop for 3 days. It fell in a steady, unhurried curtain, as if the sky had been saving up all the moisture the drought had stolen and was now returning it with interest. She woke each morning to a world that had been reshaped overnight, the familiar lines of her claim buried under a white that seemed to have no bottom to it. She dug a path to the lean-to each morning, and each afternoon she dug it again. The birds stayed inside, pressed together for warmth, their breath rising in small clouds that clung to the roof boards. She fed them the last of the good grain mixed with boiled potatoes she had been saving for herself. They ate without complaint, the way creatures eat when they trust that the hand feeding them intends their survival. On the third morning, the cold arrived. Not the ordinary cold of a Montana winter, but a deep, pulling cold that made the boards of the cabin groan and the water in the bucket freeze solid within an hour of being brought inside. She wore every piece of clothing she owned, stacked in layers that made her movements slow and deliberate. She wrapped the satchel strap around her wrist so it would not freeze stiff and crack. Henry Tolland came on the afternoon of the third day. She heard the crunch of his boots before she saw him, the sound carrying sharp and clear through the frozen air. He was leading a horse that carried a sack of feed across its back, the horse's breath pluming in great white bursts. He did not knock. He set the feed sack at the door of the lean-to and said, "Figured you might be running low." She stood in the snow, her hands wrapped in rags, her face numb around the edges. She looked at the sack. She looked at him. "I'll pay you back," she said. He shook his head. "You signed a contract. I signed a water rights agreement. We're both invested in those birds making it to spring." He did not stay. He turned and walked back the way he had come, the horse following, and the snow swallowed him before she could find the words to thank him. The cold held through the fourth day, the fifth, into the second week. The town lost 2 flocks entirely. The Morrison turkeys, already reduced to 6, were found frozen in their pen, pressed against the wire where they had tried to escape the wind and found only more wind. Mrs. Callahan's remaining geese had been brought inside her cabin, which saved them, but the story of her sleeping in the barn with them became the kind of tale that was told with sympathy and laughter both. She checked her birds twice a day. 27 heads turned toward her voice each time. 27 bodies stood close together, their feathers fluffed against the cold, their eyes clouded but calm. She talked to them. She told them stories she had heard as a girl, sang fragments of songs she barely remembered, recited the terms of the railroad contract as if they could understand. And they listened, the way they had always listened, orienting to her voice as to a fixed point in a world that had no edges they could see. The thaw came in mid-December, sudden and quiet. The temperature rose, the snow softened, and water began to run in the creek for the first time in months. The spring-fed creek on the corner of her claim ran clear and cold, and she stood at its edge and watched it move, and she felt something rise in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time. Hope. Quiet and fragile, like the first blade of grass after a fire. She walked to town that week to buy more feed. The general store was warm and crowded, and the conversation stopped when she walked in. It was not the hostile silence of the summer months, it was something else. A silence of recognition, of people who had heard the stories and were now seeing the woman herself. Mr. Davies served her with the same patient efficiency as always, but he added a piece of hard candy to her order, wrapped in wax paper, without charging her for it. "Snow's melting," he said, not looking at her. "Yes," she said. "You'll need to start thinking about spring birds soon." "The railroad contract." "I know," she said. He nodded. She took her order and left. On the road home, she passed the Morrison place. The pen was empty, the gate hanging open. Mrs. Morrison was standing at the fence, looking at nothing. She did not turn when Margaret passed. But she spoke, her voice thin and distant. "Heard yours made it through." "Yes," Margaret said. Mrs. Morrison did not say anything else. Margaret walked on. Christmas came without celebration. She had no tree, no presents, no company. She sat in the cabin with the door closed against the cold, the lantern turned low, and she listened to the birds shift in the lean-to. She thought about her mother, who had died when she was 17. She thought about the small farm in Ohio where she had grown up, the way her father had taught her to handle poultry, the way he had said, "A bird that knows your voice will never leave you," and the way she had not understood what he meant until now. She thought about Henry Tolland and the feed sack and the water rights, and the way he had looked at her when he said, "I think you might know something the rest of us have forgotten." She did not know what to do with that. January arrived with a second storm, not as long as the first, but colder. The temperature dropped to 40 below on the third night, and she brought 6 of the weakest birds into the cabin, keeping them in a crate by the stove. They survived. The others, in the lean-to, survived as well, clustering together in the way she had taught them, pressing close to the wall that shared the cabin's warmth. She spent the long nights planning. The railroad contract called for 80 birds by the 1st of May. She had 27. She needed 53 more. She could afford 15 poults from the hatchery in Billings, maybe 20 if she used the money she had set aside for the summer. The rest would have to come from the flock itself, from hatching, from careful selection, from the same method she had used to build the first 27. She did the math in the dark, over and over, until the numbers felt like a path she could walk. In February, the town held its first meeting of the new year at the community hall. She did not plan to attend. But Henry Tolland came to her door on the morning of the meeting, the first time he had crossed her yard since the night he shot the coyote, and he asked her to come. "There's talk," he said, "about the drought, about the losses all over the county, the railroads thinking of pulling their contract with anyone who can't deliver by spring." "I can deliver," she said. "I know you can, but they need to hear it from you." She did not want to go. She stood in the doorway, the feed satchel over her shoulder, the knots worn smooth, and she felt the old weight of the town's laughter pressing down on her. But she went. The meeting was held in the hall, a wooden building with a pot-bellied stove in the corner and rows of chairs that had been borrowed from the church. The room was full. Farmers, ranchers, merchants, wives, all of them sitting in the heat of the stove, all of them turned toward the front where Mr. Porter, the judge from the fair, was standing with a sheet of paper in his hands. He was reading the terms of the railroad contract requirements. The room was silent. The numbers were grim. Of the 12 farms that had signed contracts in the spring, only 3 still had flocks large enough to meet the spring delivery. The others had lost birds to drought, to coyotes, to the cold. One had given up entirely and sold his land. Mr. Porter finished reading. He looked up. "We have until the 1st of May, he said. "Any farm that cannot deliver will be dropped. And without the railroad, this county will not survive another year." The room stirred. Voices rose. Someone said it was impossible. Someone else said the railroad was asking too much. A woman near the back began to cry. Margaret sat in the 3rd row, her satchel on her lap, her hands folded over the knots. Henry Tollins stood up. He was near the back, near the door, and when he stood, the room quieted. "I've been running land in this county for 22 years, he said. "I lost my entire flock this summer, every last bird. I don't have a single turkey to deliver by May." The room was silent. "But I've been watching someone who does." He looked at her. The room looked at her. She stood up. The satchel was in her hands, and she held it the way she had held it at the auction, the way she had held it through the summer of loops and taps and low calls, the way she had held it when the coyote came, and the cold came, and the drought tried to break her. She said, "I have 27 birds. They are blind. They have never wandered. They have never been lost. They have survived the drought and the cold and the coyotes because they know my voice. And when they stop knowing my voice, I will still have their offspring, and those offspring will know it too." She paused. The room was still. "By the 1st of May, I will have 80 birds, and they will walk into the rail yard on my voice. That is my contract. That is my word." No one laughed. No one spoke. The stove crackled in the silence. Then Mr. Porter said, "I've seen her flock. She will deliver." The meeting ended. The farmers and ranchers and merchants filed out into the cold night, some shaking their heads, some nodding slowly, some not meeting her eyes. She walked home alone, the satchel over her shoulder, the stars sharp and cold above her. Behind her, Henry Tollins' horse followed at a distance, and neither of them said a word. The winter loosened its grip slowly, reluctantly, the way an old man releases a hand he has been holding too long. February bled into March with a series of false thaws that raised hopes and then dashed them with overnight freezes that turned the muddy roads to iron ruts. She walked to town twice that month, once for feed and once for mail, and each time she felt the weight of the town's attention pressing against her like a wind she could not see. The letter from the railroad arrived on the 15th of March. It was short and formal, confirming the terms of the contract and reminding her that the delivery date of May 1st was firm. No extensions, no exceptions. The railroad had its own schedules, its own contracts, its own arithmetic that did not bend for drought or cold or the quiet determination of a woman with 27 blind birds. She read the letter 3 times, then folded it and placed it inside the satchel, next to the water rights papers. The satchel was getting heavier. She did not mind. The poults arrived on the 20th of March, a crate of 15 from the hatchery in Billings. She had sent the order in January, using the money she had set aside for summer feed, betting that the spring grass would come early enough to supplement what she could not buy. The crate was smaller than the one from the auction, but the sound inside was the same, the thin, urgent cheeping of creatures who had just entered a world they could not yet understand. She opened the crate in the yard. 15 small heads emerged, blinking in the pale March light. These were not blind. Their eyes were dark and clear, and they looked around with the nervous, darting attention of seeing creatures in an unfamiliar place. She did not need them to see. She began the training that same afternoon. The same low 2-note call repeated before feeding. The same stick tapping against the packed earth. The same slow loops around the yard, with the older flock following and the new poults stumbling behind, learning by proximity, learning by the pull of movement around them. It was faster this time. The older birds knew the call, knew the rhythm, knew the shape of the pattern. The new poults followed not because they understood, but because they followed what the flock did, and the flock followed her. Within a week, the 15 were moving with the 27. Not as smoothly, not as precisely, but together. And together, she had learned, was the word that mattered. She counted them each evening. 42, then 42, then 42. Not one lost. April came with rain. Not the gentle, soaking rain of a normal spring, but the hard, driving rain of a season making up for lost time. The creek rose. The garden she planted in the first warm days was washed out twice. She replanted, and the third time it held. She had 42 birds. She needed 80. The hatchery could not supply more poults until May, which would be too late. The only way to reach 80 was through the flock itself, through eggs, through brooding, through the slow, patient work of letting the flock grow itself. She selected her best hens and set them on nests of straw in the lean-to. She marked the eggs with a pencil and turned them by hand each day, the way her father had taught her. She talked to them as she worked, low and steady, the same voice that called the flock. And she imagined the chicks inside hearing that voice before they had ears to hear it. The first hatch came on the 17th of April. 12 chicks, wet and stumbling, their eyes closed against the light. She did not touch them. She let the hen do her work. But she stood nearby and made the call, low and quiet, and she watched the small heads turn toward her, even before they had opened their eyes to the world. The second hatch came 3 days later, 9 chicks, and then 4 more from a younger hen who had surprised her by going broody. She counted on the morning of the 25th of April, 67 birds, 42 from the original training, plus 25 chicks. She needed 13 more by the 1st of May. She had 6 hens still sitting on clutches that were due to hatch any day. The numbers were close. Too close to be comfortable, but they were a shape she could work with. She was at the lean-to on the evening of the 26th, counting, when she heard the horse on the road. It was late, the light already fading, and she turned to see Henry Tolland dismounting at the fence. He looked tired. His coat was worn at the shoulders, and his hands, when he rested them on the top rail, were raw and chapped from the wind. 12 farms signed contracts last spring, he said without greeting. Only yours is still on track. She waited. The railroad sent an inspector. He's in town. He'll be making visits tomorrow. She had known this was coming. The contract allowed for inspections. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, by doing the work and letting the work speak. "Let him come," she said. Henry looked at her, then at the birds, then back at her. "There's talk that he's looking for reasons to cut the contract. The railroad's been losing money on the line. They want to reduce their commitments." The words settled into the evening air like ash after a fire. She had known this was possible. She had known it from the beginning. The contract was a promise, and promises on the frontier were only as solid as the ground they were written on. "I'll be here," she said. Henry nodded. He did not leave. He stood at the fence a moment longer, and then he said something she did not expect. "I've been thinking about what you said at the meeting. About the voice. About how they know it." She did not answer. "I lost my flock because they didn't know my voice. I thought free-ranging meant letting them go wherever they wanted. I thought that was freedom. But it wasn't. It was just abandonment with good intentions." He looked at his hands. "I'd like to learn how you do it, just in case I ever get another flock." She looked at him in the fading light, and she saw something she had not seen before. Not the loud rancher from the auction yard. Not the man who had watched her from the fence. Something smaller. Something that had been worn down and reshaped by the same drought that had reshaped her. "Come tomorrow," she said. "After the inspector. I'll show you." He nodded. He mounted his horse and rode away into the dusk. She stood at the fence until the light was gone, listening to the sounds of the flock settling behind her. Then she went inside and slept the sleep of a woman who had done everything she could and was now simply waiting for the world to respond. The inspector arrived at 9 o'clock the following morning. He was a thin man with a sharp nose and a leather case that he carried like a weapon. He introduced himself as Mr. Aldridge, and he did not shake her hand. She showed him the lean-to. She showed him the birds. She showed him the feed stores, the water supply, the records she had kept of each hatch and each feeding. He took notes without comment. His face gave nothing away. He watched her call the flock. He watched the 67 birds turn toward her voice and move in a slow, orderly arc across the yard. He watched the chicks stumble after their mothers, orienting to the sound they had heard before they hatched. He stood at the fence for a long time after she finished the loop. "These birds," he said finally, "are they all blind?" She said. "The original 27 are, the others see. And you trained them to follow your voice." "Yes." He wrote something in his notebook. Then he closed it and looked at her with an expression she could not read. "Miss Devereaux," he said, "I have been inspecting poultry operations for the railroad for 11 years. I have seen flocks that were well fed and flocks that were starving. I have seen pens that were clean and pens that were disasters. I have never seen anything like this." She waited. "Your contract will be honored," he said. "You will have 80 birds by the 1st of May. It was not a question. It was not a compliment. It was a statement of fact, delivered in the same flat tone he had used for everything else. She nodded. He packed his notebook, tipped his hat, and walked to his buggy. She stood in the yard and watched him drive away. The birds settled behind her. The satchel hung from her shoulder, the knots worn smooth, the papers inside pressed against her ribs. The sky was clear and blue. The grass was green along the fence line. The creek was running. And then the wind changed. It happened in an instant, the way it does in Montana. A shift in the air, a drop in temperature, a darkening along the western horizon that had not been there 5 minutes before. She looked up and saw the clouds piling on each other, gray and green at the edges, moving toward her faster than a horse could run. The inspector's buggy was still in sight, moving east toward town. She watched it for a moment, then turned toward the flock. The birds had already begun to stir. They could feel the change in the pressure, the way all creatures can, and there was a restlessness in their movements that had not been there before. She did not wait. She called the low note, held it, and began moving toward the lean-to. The wind hit her face, cold and sharp. The clouds were close now, and she could see the curtain of rain beneath them, dark and solid. She called again, louder this time. The flock moved with her, the older birds leading, the chicks hurrying behind. They reached the lean-to as the first raindrops fell, heavy and cold, and she counted them inside, one by one. 67. She closed the door and braced it with a board. The rain turned to hail in seconds. Small at first, then larger, pounding against the roof of the lean-to with a sound like 1,000 hammers. The birds pressed together, and she crouched among them, her hands over her head, the satchel pulled close. The hail stopped as suddenly as it had started, but the wind did not. It rose, and the sky turned green, and she knew what was coming before she could think the word. Tornado. She had never seen one, but she had heard the stories. The hollow sound, the way the air seemed to vanish, the way the ground itself seemed to rise and meet the sky. She did not have time to reach the cabin. The lean-to was on the south side of the structure, and the storm was coming from the west. She pulled the birds deeper into the shelter, pressing them against the cabin wall, and she lay down among them, her body covering the smallest chicks. The sound came, a roar, deep and steady, like a train that never arrived, and then it passed. She did not know how long it lasted. It could have been seconds. It could have been minutes. When she raised her head, the air was still, and the light was pale and strange, and the world outside the lean-to had changed. She stood up. Her legs were shaking. She pushed open the door. The cabin was gone. The roof had been lifted and thrown into the field beyond. The walls were collapsed inward, the stove tipped over, the bed frame twisted into a shape that no longer resembled anything useful. The garden was gone. The fence was gone. The road was buried under debris. She turned to the lean-to. The roof was still there. The walls were still standing. She counted. 67 birds, all of them alive. She stood in the ruin of her yard and let the silence settle around her. The wind had died completely, leaving an absence of sound that felt heavier than any noise. The sky was clearing, a pale washed blue emerging from the green-gray that had swallowed the world only minutes before. In the distance she could see the tornado's path, a dark scar across the land, cutting through fences and trees, and the roof of the Morrison barn, which lay crumpled in a field half a mile away. The cabin was gone. The garden was gone. The fence was a memory, scattered across the prairie in splinters that would take weeks to gather. But the lean-to stood, and the birds stood with it, pressed together in their quiet cluster, 70 heads turning toward her voice as she made the low call once more. She counted them again, 67, all alive, not one lost to the wind. She had no cabin to sleep in that night. She gathered what she could from the wreckage, a cast-iron skillet, a wool blanket that had been caught on a fence post 100 yards away, the metal box that held her papers. The water rights deed was still inside, the ink smudged but legible. The railroad contract was intact. She wrapped them in the blanket and carried them to the lean-to, where she sat among the birds as the sun set and the stars emerged, cold and indifferent. She had no food. The cabin's stores had been scattered across the county. She had no water beyond what she could carry from the creek. But the creek was still there, still running, and she knelt beside it in the darkness and drank until her stomach stopped shaking. Dawn came gray and quiet. She walked the 2 miles to town, the satchel over her shoulder, the knots in the strap holding fast. The road was littered with debris, a broken wagon wheel here, a man's hat there. The pages of a Bible scattered like autumn leaves. She saw the Morrison barn flattened, and the Morrison house, missing its roof. She saw a horse standing in a field, trembling, its owner nowhere in sight. The town had been spared the worst. The tornado had touched down north of the main street, cutting a path through farmland before lifting and scattering. But the damage was severe. The general store was standing, but its windows were blown out. The church had lost its steeple. The post office was untouched, but the postmaster's house had been lifted from its foundation and set down 50 feet away, still intact, as if God had picked it up and changed his mind about where he wanted it. She found Henry Tolland at the edge of town, standing on the rubble of what had been his barn. He was not injured, but his face was gray with dust and exhaustion. His flock was gone, not that he had any birds to lose, but the barn itself had collapsed, and with it, his equipment, his feed stores, the harnesses and tools that a man needs to run a ranch. He looked up when she approached. His eyes moved over her, the satchel, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, the absence of any sign that she had slept indoors. "Your birds," he said. "Alive," she said, "all of them." He closed his eyes. He did not speak for a long moment. When he opened them, there was something in them she had never seen before in any man looking at her. "Show me," he said. She walked him back to her claim. The sun was fully up now, and the damage was visible in all its ruin. The cabin lay in a pile of splintered boards, the stove on its side, the bed frame twisted into something that looked like a question mark. The garden was a muddy scar, the fence was gone, but the lean-to was there. And when she called the low 2-note, the birds emerged in their familiar, unhurried formation, clustering around her feet, heads lifted, waiting. Henry Tolland stood at the edge of the yard and looked at them. He looked at the ruin of her cabin. He looked at the lean-to, still standing, still holding the flock that had become the most valuable thing in the county. He took off his hat. "Margaret," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She did not know he knew it. "I watched them build that barn. 3 years ago. Best timber in the county. I thought it would stand forever." He stopped. He looked at the birds again. "Your lean-to was scrap boards and hope, and it's still standing, and your birds are in it." He looked at her then, directly, the way he had looked at her only a few times before. But this time, the distance was gone. The edge was gone. There was nothing left between them but the truth of what had happened. "I was wrong about you," he said. "From the beginning, at the auction, when I laughed. I was wrong." She said nothing. The birds shifted at her feet. "You bought blind birds when every man in that yard was too smart to touch them. You spent your last dollar on something nobody believed in. And you built something that survived a tornado while my barn—" He stopped. His voice cracked, just slightly, like a board under too much weight. "While my barn is gone." He put his hand on the fence post, the only post still standing. "I don't know how to say this the way it ought to be said, but I'll say it plain. You were right, and I was wrong, and I want to help you rebuild." She looked at him. The wind moved through the yard, soft and clean, carrying the smell of wet earth and splintered wood. "I'll need timber," she said. "I have timber." "I'll need feed." "I have feed." "I'll need a roof by May 1st. He looked at the lean-to. He looked at the birds. He looked at the scarred, open sky above them. "You'll have it," he said. The rebuilding began the next morning. Men from town arrived with wagons and saws and hammers, led by Mr. Davies from the general store, who had closed his shop for the day and brought a barrel of nails. The men worked without fanfare, without the jokes that had once followed her through the streets. They worked because the railroad contract was the only thing standing between the county and another season of loss, and because a woman with blind birds had become the person everyone needed. She built the new cabin herself, with Henry Tolland framing the walls beside her. The satchel hung from a peg by the door, the strap knotted twice, the papers safe inside. The birds ranged in the yard, 67 strong, answering her call before the grain hit the trough. On the evening of the 30th of April, she stood in the yard and counted. 82 birds. 17 hens had hatched another clutch while the men were working. The numbers had finally turned in her favor. The railroad agent arrived on the morning of May 1st, the same thin man with the leather case. He walked through the yard, past the new cabin, past the new fence, past the lean-to that had been reinforced and expanded. He counted the birds while she called them, while they moved in a wide, orderly arc around her voice, settling at her feet when she stopped. He closed his notebook. 82, he said. Contract fulfilled. He handed her a check. She looked at it. It was more than she had earned in the previous 3 years combined. She folded it and placed it in the satchel, next to the deed, next to the water rights papers, next to the knots that had held everything together. Henry Tolland was standing at the fence. He was not watching the agent. He was watching her. She walked over to him. The birds followed, settling behind her in their loose, familiar cluster. "I'd like to buy some of your birds off the contract," he said. "For the fall. I want to start a new flock." She thought about it. She looked at the birds, at the heads that had turned toward her voice from the moment she began, at the bodies that had followed her through drought and cold and wind and ruin. "You don't buy them," she said. "You learn them." He nodded. She said, "I'll teach you." The sun was high and warm. The grass was green. The creek was running. And on a peg by the door of a new cabin, a leather satchel hung, with its strap knotted twice, worn smooth by the hands of a woman who had believed in something no one else could see. She called the birds. They came, and she began again.